EQ might look pretty intimidating on the surface when you look at it. There's a lot going on. However, it's fairly simple to use, and there's actually really only 3 things you can do with EQing. So let's hop into the DAW and I'll show you the 3 basic methods of EQing. We're inside the DAW and I'll be using this song I've been working on to show you these 3 basic methods. And I'll just give you a little taste of what it sounds like. Sounds a little something like this. And as you can see, I already do have some EQ going on in this track, but we're going to walk through all of the methods with the Audio Issues EQ. If you haven't checked out the Audio Issues EQ yet, definitely check it out in the link in the description. It's a super useful and intuitive EQ that goes over all the language that we typically use when we want to remove frequencies such as nasal and harsh, or add things such as tone and attitude. So if you haven't checked that out, definitely check it out in the link in the description. So I've soloed our drum track and I've placed this Audio Issues EQ on that drum track. And we're going to talk about the first of the 3 methods, which is filtering. So with the Audio Issues EQ, if you hold Option and you click on an external node, so either this node or this one, we will activate what is called a filter. Okay, and a filter will either be a low pass filter up here where it allows the low frequencies to pass and also filters out the higher frequencies. And this node on the other side does the opposite. It's called a high pass filter, which filters out the low end frequencies while allowing the high frequencies to pass through. So when you filter frequencies, you eliminate them completely from the source signal. So notice that if I increase this high pass filter, we lose all the low end frequencies in our drum beat. If I bring it back here, our low end comes back. The same is true with our low pass filter. If I activate it, if I drag this, you'll notice that we lose all of the high end frequency content in our drum track. Let's bring it back up. So depending on what frequency you select, whatever frequency this node is aligned on will let the frequencies below that cutoff point pass through unscathed. The same is true, yet the opposite on the other node. All right, whatever frequency you pick, let's say 100 Hertz, this will allow anything above 100 Hertz to pass through untouched, while everything under 100 Hertz slowly gets filtered out. The amount of filtering will be dependent on the slope you choose. So a 6 decibel per octave slope is gentler and more gradual than a 24 decibel per octave slope. If you want to change the slope in the Audio Issues EQ, you can select a place to filter, say 10K, and go up here to this drop down menu and you'll have different options, 6 dB, 12 dBs, or 18 dB. So if we select 18 dB, you'll notice how the slope becomes more steep and it cuts off more aggressively, versus 6 dB is a little bit more subtle. The same is true for the high pass filter over here. We can adjust the slope to get the aggression or the intensity that we want out of the filtering. Next, let's talk about cutting and boosting. In this case, I've sold our synthesizer track and I've placed an Audio Issues EQ directly on that track. First, let's talk about cutting. This is commonly referred to as subtractive EQ. And this is when you cut a frequency to reduce its power in the frequency spectrum. Sometimes you need to cut out an annoying ringing sound or a resonance in a specific track. And sometimes you just need to cut certain frequencies to make room for other instruments in your mix. In the Audio Issues EQ, we have a section specifically designed for cutting with all of the language that would be common around what we would want to cut. So if we wanted to cut, let's say, something that was sounding boxy, we have the reference here of what frequencies might sound boxy. And then we could use a node to cut out some of those frequencies out of the frequency spectrum. So right away, you'll notice that with the frequency analyzer of this track, all the harmonics of the synth are actually nodes. They're actually sticking out amongst all the other frequencies. So let's go ahead and try cutting around there. Let's cut 300 Hertz. Right, notice how it takes out a lot of the girth, a lot of the body of the sound, and we almost just get the higher overtones. Notice how it loses a lot of its oomph. right? It loses a lot of the character of the sound, but we're still getting some of those higher harmonics, some of those higher overtones. And don't forget that you can always scroll up or down to adjust the EQ of your node. Maybe some of these higher frequencies are sounding harsh. So we could go over here, maybe have more of a narrow cut, because typically you'll want narrow cuts and broad boosts, typically speaking. And maybe this smooths out our synthesizer sound in the context of the whole mix. So maybe we'll want to cut some of the harsh frequencies, some of these mid-range frequencies to make room for the other things in our mix, such as our snare, such as our vocals, and any other melodic instruments that might be coming in. Now I've soloed the bass track and our drum track together so that we can focus on playing around with some boosting on our bass track. So this Audio Issues EQ is on the bass track and the drums and the bass are soloed. Let's talk about boosting. When you boost frequencies, you're adding more of them to the mix. You boost to add something that's missing most of the time, like presence in the vocal track, attack to a guitar, or body in your bass. So let's play around with some boosting with our bass track. I'm gonna go ahead and play it. And the first thing you'll notice is that there's a ton of low-end content in the bass. It's super sub heavy. It's pretty extreme, but that's all good. So let's move on to play around with maybe adding some character to this bass sound. And in the Audio Issues EQ, we're gonna be boosting frequencies with this bottom section of the EQ where all the thump, warmth, tone, attitude, clarity, etc. words are, versus this top section being more so used for cutting frequencies, and the language reflects that as well. So let's say we want to add some edge to our bass. We could toggle between two different EQ boosts, two different frequency sections that we want to play with. But let's start with edge, and we're going to go ahead and increase the edge. And you'll notice with this boost, there's a little bit more attack in those mids. We can also play with this focus knob to adjust the EQ of this boost. So we've added some edge and we've adjusted the focus of that boost in the Audio Issues EQ, and we can also toggle that boost on and off to compare the two. So this is without it, and this is with the boost. It adds a little bit more character, a little bit more oomph. Next, let's talk about shelving. So on many EQs, you'll find options to choose either parametric EQ bells or a shelving EQ. Okay, so a parametric bell curve will center around a specific frequency you select and affect the frequencies around that frequency equally, versus a shelf will affect the frequency you select in addition to all the frequencies above or below that frequency. So let me demonstrate that for you. So in this case, I've soloed a roomy drum track, and our synth, just to change it up a little bit, sounds like this. And we're listening for that roomy drum track. All right, so a bell EQ would be something like the nodes that we've been looking at. We find a specific frequency, let's say 1K, and if we cut this frequency, it will cut all the adjacent frequencies sloping downwards from the node we've selected. So from 1K will be the most cut frequency, and then it will taper off on both sides for both, right? We can do this for boosting and cutting. Versus something like a shelf, if we take this shelf and we pull it down, you'll notice that everything above 5K is getting pulled down, whereas it's sloping down to nothing being affected underneath 5K. The same is true with a shelf in the low end. If we were to boost a shelf at 100 Hertz, everything below 100 Hertz will also be pushed up, whereas everything above 100 Hertz will remain mostly unaffected. All right, so just keep that in mind, that if you're using an EQ bell curve, you'll be affecting all the frequencies above and below whatever frequency you pick. So in this case, 5K, we're boosting around 5K upwards and downwards. Same with cutting. We're cutting around 5K upwards and downwards, versus a shelf. If we boost a shelf at 5K, everything above 5K is getting boosted. And if we cut at 5K, everything above 5K is getting cut, whereas nothing below 5K is really getting affected. Once you've wrapped your mind around filtering, boosting, and cutting and shelving, you're well on your way to mastering EQ. And the next step on that journey is to learn what we call all the different frequency ranges in the frequency spectrum, and start to hear what they sound like. And if you're ready to learn that, click the next video and I'll see you in the next video.